The old wooden floor creaked under Sarah's bare feet as she tiptoed through the hallway, her small hands clutching a glass of water. At 7 years old, she had already learned to move like a ghost through her own home, careful not to wake the monster that slept in the master bedroom. The morning sun filtered through dirty windows, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for her like grasping fingers. Sarah's stomach growled quietly, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since the single slice of stale bread she'd managed to grab yesterday afternoon. Her father, Marcus, controlled everything in their small house on the outskirts of Pine Ridge, including when and what she could eat. Any mistake, any sound too loud, any look he didn't like, and the belt would come out. Sometimes worse. She made it to the kitchen without incident and carefully climbed onto a chair to reach the sink. Her reflection in the window showed a thin girl with tangled brown hair and eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. Dark circles shadowed her face, and a yellowing bruise decorated her left cheek from 2 days ago when she dropped a plate. The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs made her freeze. Marcus was awake, and from the sound of his movements, he was already angry about something. Sarah quickly slid down from the chair and pressed herself against the wall, hoping to become invisible. She'd learned that sometimes, if she made herself small enough, he might walk past without noticing her. "Where the hell is my coffee?" Marcus's voice boomed through the house like thunder before a storm. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as his footsteps grew closer. She could smell the stale alcohol on him before he even entered the kitchen, a sour smell that made her stomach turn. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his eyes bloodshot and his dark hair sticking up at odd angles. He wore the same clothes from yesterday, wrinkled and stained with beer and cigarette ash. His gaze swept the kitchen before landing on Sarah, and she saw his jaw tighten with familiar rage. "I asked you a question, you worthless little brat." His voice was low and dangerous, the tone that meant she was about to hurt. "Where's my coffee?" Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. "I don't know how to make coffee, Daddy. I'm sorry." The slap came so fast she didn't see it coming. Her head snapped to the side, and bright stars exploded across her vision. The taste of blood filled her mouth where her teeth had cut her inner lip. "Don't give me excuses." Marcus grabbed her arm roughly, his fingers digging into her thin flesh hard enough to leave bruises. "You're 7 years old, not a baby. You should know how to make coffee by now. What kind of useless daughter are you?" Sarah bit her lip to keep from crying, knowing that tears would only make him angrier. She'd learned that lesson the hard way many times before. Instead, she nodded quickly and tried to pull away toward the coffee maker, but his grip only tightened. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Marcus shook her until her teeth rattled. "You think you're better than me? Think you can just ignore me in my own house?" "No, Daddy. I'm sorry. I'll make your coffee right now." Sarah's words tumbled out in a rush, desperate to say whatever might make the pain stop. Marcus studied her face for a long moment, and Sarah held her breath. Sometimes, if she was very lucky, he would let her go with just a warning. But luck was something that rarely visited their house. "You're damn right you'll make my coffee." He released her arm with a push that sent her stumbling toward the counter. "And if it tastes like garbage, you'll be wearing it." Sarah climbed back onto the chair with shaking hands and reached for the coffee maker. She'd watched him make coffee before, but he'd never actually taught her how to do it. Everything in their house was a test she was expected to pass without instruction, and failure meant punishment. She managed to fill the pot with water and found the coffee grounds in the cabinet, but her hands were trembling so badly that she spilled grounds across the counter. The sound of the scattered coffee hitting the floor might as well have been a gunshot. Marcus's chair scraped against the floor as he stood up. "What did you just do?" I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Sarah scrambled to clean up the mess, trying to scoop the grounds back into the container with her small hands. "I'll clean it up, Daddy. Please don't be mad." But it was too late. Marcus crossed the kitchen in 2 long strides and grabbed a handful of her hair, jerking her head back until she was forced to look up at him. His face was red with rage, and a vein pulsed in his forehead. "You can't do anything right, can you?" Spit flew from his mouth as he spoke. "Your mother was worthless, and you're just like her. Stupid, clumsy, good for nothing." Sarah's scalp burned where he gripped her hair, but she tried not to make a sound. Talking about her mother always made him worse. She had died when Sarah was 3, and Sarah could barely remember her face now, just a vague impression of gentle hands and soft singing. But Marcus spoke of her like she was something dirty, something shameful. "Please, Daddy," Sarah whispered. "I'll be better. I promise." Marcus's laugh was ugly and sharp. "Better? You think you can get better?" He dragged her by the hair toward the living room, and Sarah's feet scrambled to keep up. "I'll show you what happens to little girls who make messes." The living room was dark and smelled of stale cigarettes and spilled beer. Empty bottles covered the coffee table, and dirty clothes lay scattered across the floor. Marcus threw Sarah down onto the couch so hard that she bounced, and she curled into a ball instinctively, trying to protect herself. "Stay there, and don't move," Marcus commanded before disappearing into his bedroom. Sarah knew what he was going for. The belt. The thick leather belt with the heavy metal buckle that had left so many marks on her small body over the years. She squeezed her eyes shut and tried to think of somewhere else, anywhere else. Sometimes she imagined she lived in the house down the road, where she could see children playing in the yard through her bedroom window. Their laughter carried on the wind, a sound so foreign to her own life that it might as well have come from another planet. Marcus returned with the belt folded in his hand, and the sight of it made Sarah's whole body tense with remembered pain. He stood over her for a moment, savoring her fear. "Take off your shirt," he ordered. Sarah's hands shook as she pulled the thin t-shirt over her head. Her back was already crisscrossed with old marks in various stages of healing, some still tender to the touch. "You know what this is for?" Marcus asked, running his thumb along the leather. "For making a mess," Sarah whispered. "That's right. And what else?" Sarah's mind raced, trying to think of the right answer. "For being bad? For being worthless?" Marcus corrected. "For being a burden. For existing when nobody wants you." The first strike came without warning, a line of fire across her shoulder blades that made her gasp. She pressed her face into the couch cushions, trying to muffle any sounds that might escape. "Count them," Marcus ordered, "and say thank you after each one." "1. Thank you, Daddy." The second strike landed lower, across her ribs. Her whole body jerked with the impact. 2. Thank you, Daddy. By the fifth strike, tears were streaming down her face despite her efforts to hold them back. By the 10th, she could taste blood where she'd bitten through her tongue. Marcus delivered each blow with methodical precision, making sure to cover every inch of her small back. When he finally stopped, Sarah lay motionless on the couch, her back on fire, and her spirit crushed once again. Marcus stood over her, breathing hard from the exertion. "Clean up that coffee mess and make it right this time," he said, buckling his belt back around his waist. "And if I have to come back in there, it'll be worse." Sarah waited until she heard him settle into his recliner and turn on the television before she moved. Every breath sent needles of pain across her back, but she forced herself to stand up and put her shirt back on. The fabric stuck to the welts, making her wince. She returned to the kitchen and carefully cleaned up the spilled coffee grounds, then tried again to make coffee. This time her hands were steadier, guided by the knowledge that failure would bring more pain. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the kitchen with the rich aroma that Marcus demanded every morning. While the coffee brewed, Sarah allowed herself a moment to look out the kitchen window. The house next door had a swing set in the backyard, painted bright red and yellow. She'd watched the family who lived there sometimes, seen the way the father pushed his children on the swings, heard their delighted squeals carry on the wind. She wondered what it would feel like to fly through the air like that, to trust that someone would catch you if you fell. The concept was so foreign to her that she couldn't quite grasp it, like trying to imagine a color that didn't exist. The coffee maker beeped, signaling that it was finished. Sarah carefully poured the hot liquid into Marcus's favorite mug, a chipped ceramic thing with a faded logo from some bar. Her hands shook slightly as she carried it to the living room, terrified of spilling even a drop. Marcus was sprawled in his recliner, watching some loud morning talk show where people screamed at each other. He didn't look up when she approached, just held out his hand expectantly. Sarah placed the mug carefully in his palm and stepped back quickly, ready to run if he decided it wasn't good enough. He took a sip and made a face. "Too weak," he said, but he didn't throw it at her, which Sarah took as a small victory. "Next time, use more grounds." "Yes, Daddy," Sarah said quietly. "And clean up this house. It's a pigsty. Your mother never kept house worth a damn either." Sarah nodded and began picking up the empty beer bottles scattered around the room. Each movement sent fresh waves of pain across her back, but she'd learned to work through the hurt. Pain was just another constant in her life, like hunger and fear and loneliness. As she worked, she could feel Marcus watching her, looking for any mistake that would justify another beating. She moved carefully, deliberately, making sure not to clink the bottles together too loudly or move too slowly. The house was small and run down, with peeling wallpaper and stains on the carpet that had been there since before Sarah could remember. The windows were dirty, filtering the sunlight into something gray and weak. Everything smelled of cigarettes and alcohol and something else, something Sarah couldn't name, but that made her think of sadness and giving up. She finished cleaning the living room and moved on to the kitchen, washing the dishes that had been piling up for days. The hot water felt good on her hands, and she let herself imagine it was washing away more than just the grease and food scraps. Through the window, she could see their nearest neighbor, Mrs. Running Bear, hanging laundry on a line in her backyard. Mrs. Running Bear was an elderly Sioux woman who lived with her husband in a neat little house surrounded by a garden full of vegetables and flowers. Sometimes Sarah caught glimpses of them working in their yard together, moving with the kind of quiet partnership that came from years of shared love. Mrs. Running Bear looked up from her laundry and caught sight of Sarah in the window. She raised her hand in a small wave, and Sarah quickly looked away, afraid that Marcus might see the interaction. He didn't like her talking to the neighbors, didn't like anyone paying attention to their business. But sometimes when Marcus was passed out drunk or had left the house, Sarah would sit by her bedroom window and watch the Running Bears tend their garden. She liked the way they worked together, never rushing, never shouting. Mr. Running Bear would point to something that needed attention, and Mrs. Running Bear would nod and move to help him, or vice versa. They moved like dancers who knew each other's steps by heart. Sarah finished the dishes and wiped down the counters, making sure everything was spotless. She could hear Marcus snoring in his chair now, which meant she had a few precious minutes to herself. She climbed the narrow stairs to her small bedroom, moving carefully to avoid the steps that creaked. Her room was barely bigger than a closet, with just enough space for a twin bed and a small dresser. The walls were bare except for water stains and cracks in the plaster. She had no toys, no books, no pictures. Marcus said such things were frivolous, that children who had food and shelter should be grateful instead of asking for more. Sarah laid down on her stomach on the thin mattress, trying to find a position that didn't press against the welts on her back. She closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's face, but the memory was like trying to hold water in her cupped hands. The harder she tried to grasp it, the more it slipped away. Sometimes she wondered if her mother would have protected her from Marcus, would have stood between them when he raised his hand. But then she remembered his words about her mother being worthless, and she wondered if maybe her mother had been just as powerless as she was now. The sound of Marcus stirring downstairs made Sarah tense up again. His footsteps were irregular, stumbling, which meant he'd probably grabbed another beer while she was cleaning. Drunk Marcus was unpredictable Marcus, capable of flying into a rage over imagined slights or perceived disrespect. "Sarah!" His voice boomed through the house. "Get down here." Sarah's stomach dropped, but she forced herself to stand up and walk downstairs. She found Marcus in the kitchen, swaying slightly as he stared at the coffee pot. "This coffee is cold," he said, holding up his mug accusingly. "Why didn't you keep it warm?" Sarah's mouth went dry. She hadn't known she was supposed to keep it warm. He'd never told her that before. "I am sorry, Daddy. I didn't know. I can make fresh coffee." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "You didn't know? You didn't know?" His voice rose with each word. What kind of brain-dead kid doesn't know that coffee needs to stay warm? Before Sarah could answer, his hand shot out and grabbed her arm again, this time hard enough to make her cry out. His grip was like iron, and she could feel her bones grinding together under the pressure. "Maybe you need a reminder about paying attention," Marcus snarled. He dragged her toward the stove and turned on one of the burners. The blue flame danced to life, casting weird shadows on the kitchen walls. Sarah's eyes went wide with terror as she realized what he intended to do. "No, please, Daddy. I'll remember next time. Please." But Marcus was beyond hearing her pleas. The alcohol and rage had combined into something monstrous, something that fed on her fear and pain. He forced her hand toward the open flame, and Sarah struggled desperately, but she was no match for his strength. The heat from the burner kissed her fingertips, and she screamed. The sound echoed through the house, a sound of pure agony and terror that seemed to go on forever. Marcus held her there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds before finally pulling her away. Sarah collapsed to the floor, cradling her burned fingers against her chest. The pain was unlike anything she'd ever experienced, a white-hot agony that made her previous beatings seem almost gentle by comparison. Marcus stood over her, breathing hard and staring at her with eyes that seemed almost surprised by what he'd done. For a moment, something like regret flickered across his features, but it was gone so quickly that Sarah might have imagined it. "That's what happens when you don't pay attention," he said finally, his voice oddly quiet. "Maybe next time you'll remember to keep the coffee warm." He turned and walked away, leaving Sarah sobbing on the kitchen floor. She stayed there for a long time, too afraid to move, too hurt to care about anything except the burning pain in her fingers. Eventually, she managed to crawl to the sink and run cold water over her hand. The relief was minimal, but it was something. She wrapped her fingers in a dish towel and sat on the floor, rocking back and forth as tears streamed down her face. This was her life. This was all she had ever known and all she could imagine ever knowing. Pain and fear and the constant walking on eggshells, waiting for the next explosion of violence. She was 7 years old, and she already felt ancient, worn down by a lifetime of abuse that showed no signs of ending. Outside the window, she could hear children laughing as they played in their yards, their voices bright with joy and innocence. The sound seemed to come from another world, a place where children were loved and protected instead of beaten and burned. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to imagine what it would feel like to live in that world, but the concept was too foreign, too impossible. She was trapped here, in this house with this monster, and there was nowhere to run and no one to save her. The afternoon stretched ahead of her like a minefield, full of potential triggers that could set Marcus off again. She would have to be perfect, invisible, silent. She would have to anticipate his every need and desire while making no needs or desires of her own known. And tomorrow would be exactly the same. And the day after that. And the day after that, stretching on into an endless future of pain and fear and hopelessness. Sarah wrapped the dish towel tighter around her burned fingers and prepared herself for whatever came next. 3 months had passed since the incident with the stove, and Sarah's fingers had healed into small, shiny scars that she often traced when she thought no one was looking. The burns had been the worst injury Marcus had ever inflicted, but they were far from the last. If anything, that day had seemed to break some final restraint in him, as if crossing that line had made it easier to cross others. The beatings came more frequently now, triggered by increasingly minor infractions. Sarah had learned to read the signs of his mounting rage like a meteorologist tracking storm systems. The way his jaw twitched when he drank his morning beer. The particular set of his shoulders when he'd had a bad day at the construction site where he worked sporadically. The dangerous quiet that preceded his explosions. She'd also learned new ways to hide. The cramped space under the basement stairs where she could curl up behind old boxes. The narrow gap between her dresser and the wall where she could make herself small enough to disappear. The shed in the backyard where she could slip out through a loose board if she heard him coming. But hiding only worked when Marcus was too drunk to look for her properly. And lately, even his drunk rages seemed more focused, more deliberate. Sarah sat on her bedroom floor, carefully applying a cold washcloth to the fresh bruises on her ribs. She'd made the mistake of asking for dinner last night, when Marcus had forgotten to feed her for 2 days straight. Her stomach had been cramping with hunger, and the words had slipped out before she could stop them. The beating that followed had been methodical and cruel. Marcus had made her count each blow again, but this time he'd used his fists instead of the belt. Her ribs ached with every breath, and she suspected at least one might be cracked. Through her bedroom window, she could see Mrs. Running Bear working in her garden, carefully tending to rows of corn and beans. The old woman moved slowly but purposefully, her weathered hands gentle with the plants. Sometimes she sang while she worked, traditional songs in her native language that carried on the wind like prayers. Sarah pressed her face against the glass, watching hungrily. Mrs. Running Bear represented everything Sarah had never experienced. Gentleness, nurturing, peace. Sometimes she fantasized about walking out her front door and crossing the yard to the Running Bear's house, imagining what it would be like to be welcomed with kind words instead of violence. But such thoughts were dangerous. Marcus had made it clear that she was never to bother the neighbors, never to give them any reason to pay attention to their household. Mind your own business, he'd warned her repeatedly. Nobody wants to hear about our private family matters. The sound of the front door slamming downstairs made Sarah jump away from the window. Marcus was home from whatever bar he'd spent the afternoon at, and from the sound of his unsteady footsteps, he'd been drinking heavily. Sarah, his voice boomed through the house, already edged with irritation. Where the hell are you? Sarah quickly hid the washcloth under her mattress and hurried downstairs. She found Marcus in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a half-empty bottle of whiskey in his hand. His eyes were bloodshot and unfocused, and his clothes reeked of alcohol and cigarette smoke. I want dinner, he announced without preamble. And it better be good, not the garbage you tried to feed me last week. Sarah's heart sank. There was almost no food in the house. Marcus had drunk away most of his last paycheck, and he rarely remembered to buy groceries. The refrigerator contained a carton of spoiled milk, some moldy cheese, and half a loaf of stale bread. What would you like me to make, Daddy? Sarah asked carefully, hoping he might give her some guidance that would help her avoid his wrath. Marcus took a long swig from the bottle and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Figure it out yourself. That's what daughters are for, isn't it? Taking care of their fathers. Sarah opened the refrigerator and surveyed the meager contents with growing panic. There was nothing here that could be turned into anything resembling a proper meal. She could toast the bread, but that would hardly satisfy Marcus in his current state. Maybe I could go to the store, she suggested tentatively. If you gave me some money, I could buy. The backhand came so fast she didn't see it coming. Her head snapped to the side, and she tasted blood where her teeth cut her lip. Did I say you could go to the store? Marcus snarled. Did I say I want to waste money feeding your worthless face? Make dinner with what's here, or don't eat for a week. Sarah nodded quickly and turned back to the refrigerator, her mind racing. She could smell the alcohol on his breath, could see the dangerous glitter in his eyes that meant he was looking for an excuse to hurt her. Whatever she made, it wouldn't be good enough. But she had to try. She toasted the bread and tried to scrape the mold off the cheese, arranging it on a plate with shaking hands. It looked pathetic, like something you might feed to a stray dog, but it was all she had to work with. Marcus stared at the plate when she set it in front of him, his expression growing darker by the second. He picked up a piece of the toast and examined it like it was something diseased. This is what you think I deserve? He asked, his voice deceptively quiet. Moldy cheese and burned toast. It's all we have, Sarah whispered. I try to make it nice. Marcus stood up so abruptly that his chair fell backward, clattering to the floor. All we have? Whose fault is that? Who spent the grocery money on beer and lottery tickets? Sarah knew better than to answer, knew that any response would only make him angrier. But her silence seemed to enrage him even more. Answer me. He grabbed her shoulders and shook her violently. Whose fault is it that there's no food in this house? I don't know, Sarah gasped, the words forced out of her by his shaking. You don't know? Marcus's laugh was ugly and harsh. It's your fault, you little parasite. Everything that goes wrong in this house is your fault. You're the reason your mother died. You're the reason I drink. You're the reason I can't keep a steady job. Each accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd heard these words before, but they never stopped hurting, never stopped making her feel like something small and dirty and worthless. You want to know what your mother said before she died? Marcus continued, his grip tightening on her shoulders. She said she wished she'd never had you. Said you were the biggest mistake of her life. Sarah felt something crack inside her chest, some final piece of hope or innocence breaking apart. That's not true, she whispered, the words barely audible. Marcus's eyes widened with rage. Did you just call me a liar? Did you just tell me I'm wrong about what my own wife said? Before Sarah could respond, his hand closed around her throat. Not enough to cut off her air completely, but enough to make breathing difficult, enough to send panic shooting through her entire body. Maybe it's time you joined her, Marcus said conversationally, as if he was discussing the weather. Maybe it's time I stopped pretending you're worth keeping around. Sarah clawed at his hand, her feet barely touching the ground as he lifted her slightly. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision, and a horrible rushing sound filled her ears. This was it. This was how she was going to die, in this kitchen that smelled of spoiled food and broken dreams. Then, suddenly, he released her. Sarah collapsed to the floor, gasping and coughing, her throat on fire. Marcus stood over her, breathing hard, something like surprise flickering across his features as if he'd just realized what he'd been about to do. "Clean up this mess," he said finally, gesturing at the scattered food. "And stay out of my sight for the rest of the night." He grabbed his bottle and stumbled toward the living room, leaving Sarah crumpled on the kitchen floor. She lay there for a long time, touching her throat gingerly and trying to process what had just happened. He'd almost killed her, actually tried to strangle her to death over a piece of toast. The realization settled over her like a cold weight. Things weren't going to get better. They were never going to get better. Marcus was going to keep hurting her, keep escalating, until one day he went too far and she didn't survive it. Sarah forced herself to stand up and clean the kitchen, moving like a robot through the familiar motions. But for the first time in her young life, a new thought was taking shape in her mind. A dangerous, terrifying, impossible thought. She had to get away. The idea was so foreign, so overwhelming, that she almost pushed it away immediately. Where would she go? How would she survive? Marcus had spent years convincing her that she was worthless, that no one would ever want her, that she was lucky he even kept her around. But as she wiped down the counter with mechanical precision, Sarah found herself thinking about the children she watched playing in other yards. They didn't look afraid. They didn't flinch when adults spoke to them. They laughed and ran and seemed to take their safety for granted. Maybe, somewhere out there, there were adults who didn't hurt children. Adults who might even help them. The thought was so radical, so against everything Marcus had taught her about the world, that it made her dizzy. But once it had taken root, she couldn't shake it loose. Sarah finished cleaning and crept upstairs to her room. Marcus had turned the television up loud, drowning out the sounds of her movements. She sat on her bed and stared out the window at the Running Bear's house, where warm yellow light glowed in the windows. Mrs. Running Bear was sitting on her porch now, working on some kind of beadwork in the fading light. She looked peaceful, content, safe in her own space. Sarah wondered what it would feel like to sit somewhere without constantly listening for approaching footsteps, without calculating escape routes and hiding places. A wild idea began forming in her mind. What if she did run away? Not far, not to some unknown place full of strangers, but just across the yard of the house where the kind woman lived. Mrs. Running Bear had always smiled at her when their eyes met. Maybe she would listen. Maybe she would help. The idea was terrifying and thrilling at the same time. Sarah had never considered the possibility that she might have any control over her situation, that there might be alternatives to simply enduring whatever Marcus chose to do to her. She waited until she heard Marcus's snores rumbling through the house before she dared to move. Moving as quietly as possible, she gathered what few belongings she had, a change of clothes, the dish towel she sometimes used to clean her wounds, and a small piece of her mother's jewelry that Marcus had somehow overlooked during his drunken rages. Then she sat by her window and waited. Not for tonight. She wasn't brave enough yet, and she needed to plan more carefully. But soon, very soon, she would find the courage to cross that yard and knock on the Running Bear's door. The thought sustained her through the long, wakeful hours of the night. For the first time in her life, Sarah went to sleep thinking about possibility instead of just survival. It was a fragile hope, as delicate as spun glass, but it was hers. And for now, that was enough. The next morning brought no relief from the tension that had settled over the house like a toxic fog. Marcus woke with a hangover that made him even more volatile than usual, snapping at Sarah for breathing too loudly, for existing too visibly in his presence. Sarah moved through her morning routine like a sleepwalker, going through the motions of making coffee and cleaning while her mind churned with plans and possibilities. She kept glancing out the window at the Running Bear's house, tried to work up the courage to act on the desperate plan that had formed in the darkness. But courage was in short supply, and fear was an old, familiar companion. What if Mrs. Running Bear didn't believe her? What if she sent Sarah back home? What if Marcus found out she tried to ask for help? The consequences of failure were too terrible to contemplate. So Sarah continued her careful dance around Marcus's rage, biding her time, waiting for the right moment to take the biggest risk of her young life. She didn't know it yet, but that moment was coming sooner than she thought. The final confrontation that would force her hand was already building, like storm clouds gathering on a summer afternoon. And when it came, Sarah would have to choose between the familiar hell she knew and the uncertain hope of something better. The choice, when it arrived, would define the rest of her life. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the leaves were dying and the air carried the promise of winter. Sarah had been living on a knife's edge for weeks now, watching Marcus spiral deeper into alcohol and rage, feeling the violence in their house building like pressure in a kettle about to explode. She woke that morning to the sound of glass breaking downstairs, followed by Marcus's voice raised in a string of curses that would have made sailors blush. Sarah lay frozen in her bed, listening to his heavy footsteps pacing back and forth across the living room floor. Something had set him off early today, and that never boded well for her. The smell of alcohol was already heavy in the air when Sarah crept downstairs, even though it wasn't yet 8 in the morning. Marcus stood in the kitchen surrounded by the remains of what had once been his coffee mug, the broken pieces scattered across the linoleum like brown ceramic confetti. His face was flushed red with rage, and his hands shook as he clutched a half-empty bottle of whiskey. When he saw Sarah in the doorway, his eyes fixed on her with the focused intensity of a predator selecting its prey. "Look what you made me do," he said, gesturing at the broken mug with the bottle. "Your worthless face made me so angry I broke my favorite cup." Sarah knew better than to point out that she'd been asleep upstairs when the mug broke. Logic had no place in Marcus's world, where everything bad that happened was somehow her fault by default. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she said quietly, already moving toward the broom closet to clean up the mess. "I'll clean it up right away." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You think sorry fixes everything? You think you can just apologize and make everything better?" Sarah had learned to read the signs of his rages like a survival manual, and everything about his posture and tone told her that this was going to be bad. Worse than usual, perhaps worse than anything that had come before. She began sweeping up the broken ceramic, moving carefully to avoid cutting herself on the sharp edges. Marcus watched her work, taking occasional swigs from his bottle, and Sarah could feel his anger building like heat radiating from furnace. "You know what your problem is?" Marcus said suddenly, his words slightly slurred. "You think you're special. You think because you're small and pathetic, people should feel sorry for you." Sarah kept sweeping, hoping that if she stayed quiet and focused on her task, he might lose interest and wander away. But she could feel him moving closer, could sense the violence coiling in his muscles like a spring under tension. "I'm talking to you," Marcus roared, and suddenly his hand was in her hair, jerking her head up so violently that she dropped the broom. "When I talk, you listen." The bottle fell from his other hand and shattered on the floor, adding more glass to the mess and filling the kitchen with the sharp reek of whiskey. Marcus didn't seem to notice. His grip on her hair tightened until Sarah could feel individual strands being pulled from her scalp. "Please," she gasped, her hands instinctively reaching up to try to relieve the pressure on her hair. "Please, Daddy, you're hurting me. Hurting you." Marcus's voice rose to a near scream. "You want to know what hurt is? I'll show you what hurt is." He dragged her by the hair into the living room, Sarah's feet scrambling to keep up as pain exploded across her scalp. The familiar terror washed over her, but underneath it, something new was stirring. Not just fear, but a deep, bone-deep exhaustion with the endless cycle of violence and pain. Marcus threw her down on the couch so hard that she bounced, then stood over her breathing heavily. His face was purple with rage, and spittle flew from his mouth as he spoke. 8 years, he shouted. 8 years I've been stuck with you. 8 years of your whining, and your crying, and your pathetic face looking at me like I'm some kind of monster. Sarah curled into a ball on the couch, trying to make herself as small as possible. But even as she cowered, a small voice in the back of her mind was whispering that this couldn't go on. Something had to change, or he was going to kill her. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. "You ruined my life," Marcus continued, beginning to pace back and forth in front of the couch. "Before you came along, I had possibilities. I had dreams. Your mother and we were going to travel, see the world. But then you showed up and ruined everything." He stopped pacing and fixed his bloodshot gaze on Sarah. "You killed her, you know that? The stress of having you, of trying to raise something as worthless as you, it killed her from the inside out." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but she bit her lip to keep from making any sound. Crying would only make him angrier, would give him more reason to hurt her. "And now you're trying to kill me too," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Every day, just by existing, you're sucking the life out of me. Well, I'm done. I'm done pretending you're worth keeping around. He lunged for her then, his hands reaching for her throat just as they had a few nights before. But this time, something inside Sarah snapped. Instead of freezing with terror, instead of submitting to whatever he wanted to do to her, she rolled off the couch and ran. She heard Marcus roar with rage behind her as she bolted for the front door. Her bare feet slipped on the glass scattered across the kitchen floor, and she felt sharp pain as shards cut into her soles. But she couldn't stop, because she knew with absolute certainty that if Marcus caught her this time, she wouldn't survive. The front door seemed miles away, but somehow her shaking hands managed to work the deadbolt. She could hear Marcus's heavy footsteps pounding behind her, could hear him cursing and threatening as he gave chase. The door flew open, and Sarah burst out into the cool October morning. She didn't pause to think about where she was going or what she would do next. There was only the immediate need to get away, to put distance between herself and the monster that had been hunting her for her entire life. Her feet carried her across the dead grass of their front yard, past the mailbox with its faded lettering, toward the neat little house where Mrs. Running Bear lived. She could hear Marcus behind her, could hear him screaming her name along with threats of what he would do when he caught her. "Sarah, get back here right now. You get back here this instant, or I swear I'll kill you." But his voice was getting fainter, and when Sarah risked a glance over her shoulder, she saw that he'd stopped at the edge of their property. Even drunk and enraged, some part of Marcus still understood that chasing a screaming child across the neighbor's yards might attract the wrong kind of attention. Sarah reached the Running Bear's front porch and pounded on the door with both fists, not caring that her bloody feet were leaving red prints on their clean welcome mat. She could hear movement inside, could hear voices speaking in what she thought might be Lakota. "Please," she sobbed, still hammering on the door. "Please help me. Please." The door opened so suddenly that Sarah almost fell inside. Mrs. Running Bear stood in the doorway, her weathered face creased with concern and alarm. She was a small woman, not much taller than Sarah herself, but there was something solid and unshakable about her presence. "Child," Mrs. Running Bear said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that Sarah had never heard directed at her before. "What has happened to you?" Sarah tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. 8 years of terror and pain and carefully learned silence had stolen her voice. All she could do was stand there shaking, bleeding, sobbing, hoping that this kind woman would understand without words what she couldn't find the courage to say. Mrs. Running Bear's eyes took in Sarah's condition with the trained gaze of someone who had seen too much suffering in her lifetime. The bruises on Sarah's face, the cuts on her feet, the way she flinched when Mrs. Running Bear moved too quickly, it all told a story that needed no words. "Joseph," Mrs. Running Bear called over her shoulder, never taking her eyes off Sarah. "Joseph, come quickly." Mr. Running Bear appeared in the doorway, a tall man with silver-streaked braids and eyes that held the same warmth as his wife's. When he saw Sarah, his jaw tightened with controlled anger, but his voice remained gentle. "Bring her inside, Grace," he said quietly. "Quickly, before he comes after her." Mrs. Running Bear, Grace, reached out slowly, telegraphing her movements so as not to startle Sarah. When Sarah didn't flinch away, Grace gently took her arm and guided her inside, closing the door firmly behind them. The inside of the Running Bear's house was everything that Sarah's home was not. Clean, warm, filled with the smell of cooking food and the soft sound of traditional music playing on an old radio. Handmade quilts covered comfortable-looking furniture, and the walls were decorated with family photographs and traditional artwork. Sarah stood, dripping blood on their clean floor, still shaking with shock and terror. She expected them to be angry about the mess, expected them to demand explanations or threaten to send her back home. But instead, Grace knelt down so that she was at eye level with Sarah, her movements slow and non-threatening. "You're safe now," Grace said softly, and something in her voice made Sarah believe it might actually be true. "No one is going to hurt you here. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded mutely, still not trusting her voice to work. "Good," Grace said, standing up with the careful movements of someone whose joints had seen many winters. "Joseph, call the police, and then call Dr. Martinez. Tell her we have a child who needs medical attention." "No." Sarah found her voice at last, panic flooding through her at the mention of police and doctors. Please don't call anyone. He'll be so angry if you call people. He'll find me and he'll... Shh, Grace said, her voice impossibly gentle. Child, look at me. Look at my eyes. Sarah forced herself to meet the older woman's gaze, expecting to see the irritation or disgust she was used to seeing in adult faces. Instead, she saw only kindness and a deep, abiding sadness. What's your name, sweetheart? Grace asked. Sarah, she whispered. Sarah, that's a beautiful name. Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully. That man cannot hurt you anymore. The police are going to make sure of that. Do you understand? Sarah shook her head frantically. You don't understand. He's my daddy. They'll make me go back to him. They always make kids go back to their families. Joseph, who had been standing quietly by the phone, spoke up for the first time. Not when the family is hurting them, little one. There are laws to protect children, even from their own parents. But I don't have anywhere else to go, Sarah said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I don't have any other family. If you send me away, I'll have to go back to him. And he said, she couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the threats Marcus had made about what would happen if she ever tried to run away. Grace and Joseph exchanged a look over Sarah's head, one of those wordless conversations that long-married couples could have with just their eyes. When Grace looked back at Sarah, her expression had softened even further. Sarah, she said carefully, what would you say if I told you that you might not have to go back to him at all? That there might be other options for you? Sarah stared at her, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. What kind of options? Well, Grace said, settling carefully onto the couch and patting the cushion beside her. Sometimes when a child's parents can't take care of them properly, other families step in to help. Families who have room in their hearts and their homes for children who need love and safety. Sarah perched on the edge of the couch cushion, ready to bolt if necessary, but drawn by the incredible possibility that Grace might be offering something she'd never even dared to dream of. You mean like adoption? Sarah asked in a whisper. She'd heard the word before, seen it in television shows, but it had always seemed like something that happened to other people in other worlds. Sometimes, Grace said carefully, it's not always easy, and there are a lot of people who have to be involved to make sure it's the right thing. But, yes, sometimes children find new families when their birth families can't give them what they need. Sarah felt something crack open inside her chest, some hard shell of despair and resignation that had been protecting her heart for as long as she could remember. Hope was a dangerous thing, she knew that. Hope could lead to disappointment, and disappointment could hurt worse than any beating. But sitting in this warm, safe house, with these kind people who spoke to her like she was something precious rather than something broken, Sarah couldn't help but let that dangerous hope take root. Would anyone want me? She asked, her voice barely audible. Marcus always said nobody would ever want me because I'm too much trouble. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. Oh, sweetheart, you're not too much trouble. You're a gift. Any family would be lucky to have you. Before Sarah could respond, the sound of pounding on the front door made all three of them freeze. Marcus's voice came through the wood, slurred with alcohol, but still carrying the edge of barely controlled violence. I know she's in there. Send her out right now, or I'm calling the cops. That's my daughter, and you can't keep her from me. Sarah pressed herself back into the couch cushions, her brief moment of hope crumbling into familiar terror. He found me, she whispered. He's going to make me go back. But Joseph was already moving toward the door, his face set in grim determination. No, he said firmly. He's not. Grace reached over and took Sarah's hand, her calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. Trust us, she said quietly. This ends today. Outside, Marcus continued to pound on the door and shout threats, but for the first time in her life, Sarah wasn't alone in facing the monster that had haunted her childhood. She had allies now, people who were willing to stand between her and the violence that had defined her world. It was a feeling so foreign, so overwhelming, that Sarah almost couldn't process it. But as Grace held her hand and Joseph moved to confront the man who had terrorized her for 8 long years, Sarah began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she might actually have a chance at something better. The battle for her freedom was just beginning, but for the first time in her life, Sarah wasn't facing it alone. The police arrived within minutes of Joseph's call, their patrol car pulling up to the Running Bears' house, just as Marcus was beginning to kick at their front door. Sarah watched from behind Grace's living room curtains as two officers approached her father, their hands resting casually, but meaningfully on their service weapons. Marcus's demeanor changed instantly when he saw the uniforms. The rage that had driven him across the yard suddenly transformed into the performance he'd perfected over the years. The grieving single father, the concerned parent just trying to retrieve his runaway daughter. "Officers, thank God you're here," Marcus said, his voice carrying just the right note of relief and worry. "My little girl ran away this morning. I think she's in that house, and these people won't let me see her." Sarah felt her stomach drop as she watched Marcus deploy the same charm that had fooled social workers and teachers before. He was good at this, good at becoming whoever he needed to be when authority figures were watching. Officer Martinez, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and silver threading through her dark hair, listened to Marcus's explanation with professional courtesy. But her partner, Officer Chun, was already studying the situation with the careful attention of someone who'd seen too many domestic disturbances. "Sir, we're going to need to speak with your daughter to make sure she's okay," Officer Martinez said. "If she's inside, we need to verify her well-being before we can discuss next steps." Marcus's performance never wavered, but Sarah caught the flash of anger in his eyes. Of course. I just want to make sure she's safe. She's been having some behavioral problems lately, acting out, you understand? Grief does strange things to children." Sarah pressed closer to the window, straining to hear every word. Marcus was already laying the groundwork for his defense, painting her as a troubled child prone to wild stories and attention-seeking behavior. Joseph opened the front door before the officers could knock, his expression calm but determined. "Officers, please come in. The child is safe, but she's been seriously injured and she's very frightened." As the officers entered the house, Sarah shrank back behind Grace, suddenly terrified that they would believe Marcus's version of events and force her to go home with him. She'd heard horror stories from other kids at school about children who tried to report abuse only to be returned to their abusers when the adults didn't believe them. Officer Martinez knelt down to Sarah's eye level, her movements slow and non-threatening. "Hi there. I'm Officer Martinez. What's your name, sweetheart?" "Sarah," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Sarah, can you tell me what happened to your feet? I can see that you're bleeding." Sarah glanced nervously at Grace, who nodded encouragingly. "I stepped on glass when I was running," Sarah said. "Running from what?" Officer Chun asked gently. Sarah's throat closed up with fear. This was the moment of truth, the moment when she would have to choose between the familiar hell she knew and the terrifying possibility of something unknown. If she told the truth, and they didn't believe her, Marcus would make her pay for it in ways she couldn't even imagine. But if she lied, if she let him take her home, she knew with bone-deep certainty that she wouldn't survive much longer. "For my daddy," she said finally, the words coming out in a rush. "He was trying to hurt me again, and I got scared and ran away." Officer Martinez's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. "Again? Can you tell me about the other times he hurt you?" Sarah looked around the room at the faces watching her, Grace and Joseph with their warm encouragement, the officers with their professional concern. For the first time in her life, adults were actually listening to her, actually taking her seriously. So she started talking. She told them about the beatings, about the belt, and the fists, and the burn on her fingers from the stove. She told them about being starved for days when Marcus spent the grocery money on alcohol, about sleeping on the floor when he decided her bed was too good for her, about the threats, and the name-calling, and the constant fear that permeated every moment of her existence. The words poured out of her like water from a broken dam. 8 years of carefully suppressed trauma, finding voice at last. She told them things she'd never spoken aloud, secrets she'd kept buried so deep she'd almost forgotten they existed. Officer Chin took notes while Officer Martinez asked gentle questions, drawing out details that painted a picture of systematic abuse and neglect. Neither officer seemed shocked by what they were hearing, which somehow made it easier for Sarah to continue talking. "Sarah," Officer Martinez said when Sarah finally ran out of words, "I need to ask you something important. Do you feel safe going back home with your father?" "No," Sarah said without hesitation. "He said he was going to kill me this time. He said he was done pretending I was worth keeping around." The officers exchanged a meaningful look. Officer Chin stood up and moved toward the door. "I'm going to speak with your father now, Sarah." Officer Martinez is going to stay here with you while we figure out what happens next. Through the window, Sarah could see Officer Chen approaching Marcus, who was still standing on the Running Bears lawn, maintaining his pose of concerned fatherhood. But as the officer began asking questions, Sarah watched her father's mask begin to slip. Dr. Martinez arrived while Officer Chen was still questioning Marcus outside. She was a small woman with kind eyes and gentle hands who examined Sarah's injuries with professional thoroughness while explaining each step of what she was doing. "These cuts on your feet will need to be cleaned and bandaged," Dr. Martinez said as she worked. "And I'm concerned about some of these older injuries. Can you tell me how you got this scar on your hand?" Sarah looked down at the shiny mark where the stove flame had burned her months earlier. "Daddy held my hand over the fire because I made bad coffee," she said matter-of-factly. Dr. Martinez paused in her examination, her jaw tightening with controlled anger. "Sarah, I'm going to need to take some photographs of your injuries. Is that okay with you?" Sarah nodded, understanding instinctively that the photographs would serve as evidence, proof that couldn't be denied or explained away. As Dr. Martinez documented each bruise, each scar, each mark that Marcus's violence had left on Sarah's small body, Sarah felt something she'd never experienced before, the sense that adults were finally taking her seriously, finally believing that what was happening to her mattered. Outside, the conversation between Officer Chun and Marcus was growing more heated. Sarah could see her father's face getting redder, could see the familiar signs of his mounting rage. But this time, there was a police officer standing between him and his target, and that changed everything. Officer Martinez finished taking Sarah's statement and reviewing Dr. Martinez's findings. When Officer Chun returned from his conversation with Marcus, his expression was grim. "Sarah has quite a different version of events," Officer Chun reported. According to him, Sarah is a troubled child who frequently injures herself for attention. He claims she's been seeing a therapist for behavioral problems, and that this is just the latest in a series of incidents. Sarah felt her heart sink. Of course Marcus would have an explanation. He always had explanations. But Officer Martinez was nodding thoughtfully. Did he provide any documentation for these alleged therapy sessions? Contact information for the therapist? He said the therapist's name is Dr. Williams, but he couldn't provide an address or phone number. Said his insurance paperwork is at home. Convenient, Officer Martinez said dryly. And I suppose he had an explanation for the burn scar on her hand? Says she touched the stove by accident while he was cooking. Blames himself for not watching her more carefully. Dr. Martinez spoke up from where she was finishing her examination of Sarah. "Officer, in my professional opinion, these injuries are absolutely consistent with systematic physical abuse. The pattern of healing suggests repeated trauma over an extended period. This child has been tortured." Sarah watched the officers absorb this information, saw the way their expressions hardened with professional resolve. For the first time since running across the yard that morning, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the adults were going to protect her instead of sending her back to Marcus. "What happens now?" Grace asked, her arm wrapped protectively around Sarah's shoulders. Officer Martinez looked at Sarah with gentle eyes. "Now we make sure you're safe, sweetheart. Your father is not going to be able to hurt you anymore." "But where will I go?" Sarah asked, the question that had been haunting her since she'd first contemplated running away. "I don't have any other family. That's something the Department of Children and Families will figure out," Officer Martinez explained. "For tonight, you'll stay in a safe place while we investigate further. And tomorrow, there will be people whose job it is to find the best possible situation for you." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in years, they weren't tears of pain or fear. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of overwhelming emotion at the realization that her nightmare might actually be ending. Grace hugged her closer, and Sarah could feel the older woman's own tears falling into her hair. "It's going to be okay, little one," Grace whispered. "You're so brave. You did the right thing." Through the window, Sarah watched as Officer Chun approached Marcus with handcuffs. Her father's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the rage and hatred that had been lurking underneath. He screamed and fought as they arrested him, his voice carrying across the yard in a stream of threats and profanity that made several neighbors come out to see what was happening. But the threats couldn't reach her now. There were strong walls and kind people between her and Marcus's violence, and for the first time in her young life, Sarah began to understand what safety might feel like. The investigation that followed would reveal the full extent of Marcus's abuse, would uncover evidence of neglect and violence that went back years. Neighbors would come forward with stories of screams in the night. Teachers would report concerns they'd had but never acted on, and the pattern of systematic abuse would become impossible to deny. But all of that was still to come. For now, Sarah sat in Grace Running Bear's warm living room, surrounded by kindness and protection, and began the long journey toward healing that would define the rest of her life. The little girl who had learned to move through her own house like a ghost was finally ready to step into the light. 6 months had passed since that October morning, when Sarah's life had changed forever. The child who had once flinched at sudden movements and spoke in whispers now sat confidently at the kitchen table in the Running Bear's house, helping Grace prepare traditional fry bread for dinner. The transition hadn't been immediate or easy. The Department of Children and Families had initially placed Sarah in a group home while they investigated her case and looked for appropriate placement options. Those weeks had been frightening in their own way. Sleeping in a room with 3 other girls, following strict schedules, navigating the complex social dynamics of children who had all been damaged by their experiences with adults. But Grace and Joseph had visited her every day that visits were allowed, bringing small gifts and gentle conversation that helped Sarah remember there was kindness in the world. They had attended every court hearing, every placement meeting, every case review, their presence a steady anchor in the chaos of legal proceedings and social work bureaucracy. When the paperwork was finally complete and the Running Bears were approved as Sarah's permanent guardians, the transition to their home had been like stepping from a black and white world into one full of color. "Roll it thinner, little bird," Grace said gently, using the nickname she'd given Sarah after watching her dart around the house like a small creature learning to use its wings. "The bread will be too thick if you don't roll it out enough." Sarah pressed down harder with the rolling pin, her tongue poking out in concentration. Cooking had become one of her favorite activities, partly because Grace was patient and encouraging, but mostly because it was something she'd never been allowed to do before. In Marcus's house, the kitchen had been a place of danger and scarcity. Here, it was the warm heart of a home where love was expressed through shared meals and gentle instruction. "Like this?" Sarah asked, stepping back to examine her work. "Perfect," Grace said, and Sarah glowed with pride at the simple approval. After 8 years of never doing anything right, the experience of succeeding at small tasks was still intoxicating. Joseph appeared in the kitchen doorway, his reading glasses perched on his nose, and a newspaper folded under his arm. At 62, he moved with the careful grace of a man who had worked with his hands his whole life, but was beginning to feel the weight of accumulated years. His presence filled the room with quiet strength, and Sarah had learned to associate his footsteps with safety rather than fear. "How are my girls doing?" he asked, a question that never failed to make Sarah's heart flutter with belonging. His girls. She was on his girls now. "Sarah's learning to make fry bread," Grace reported, her voice warm with pride. "She's a natural cook." Sarah beamed at the praise, then remembered something that dimmed her smile slightly. "Joseph, can I ask you something?" "Of course, little bird. What's on your mind?" Sarah hesitated, twisting her hands in the apron Grace had given her. Even after 6 months of love and safety, some conversations still felt dangerous, still carried the weight of old fears. "The social worker is coming next week for my check-in," Sarah said carefully. "What if she decides I can't stay here anymore? What if she thinks you don't want me?" The question hung in the air like a small cloud, threatening to darken the warm atmosphere of the kitchen. Sarah had asked variations of this question dozens of times over the past months, her young mind struggling to accept that love and safety could be permanent rather than conditional. Joseph set down his newspaper and crossed the kitchen to where Sarah stood. He knelt down so he was at her eye level, a gesture that had once terrified her, but now signaled the beginning of an important conversation. "Sarah," he said gently, "do you remember what we told you the day the adoption papers were finalized?" Sarah nodded. "You said I was part of your family forever now, that nobody could take me away anymore." "That's right. And do you know what forever means?" "It means always. It means no matter what." "Exactly." Joseph reached out and took her flour-dusted hands in his calloused ones. "It means when you have nightmares, we're here. When you're happy, we're here. When you're angry or sad or confused, we're here. It means you belong with us, and nothing, not social workers, not paperwork, not anything, can change that. Sarah felt the familiar sting of tears, but these were the good kind of tears that came from overwhelming gratitude rather than pain. But what if I do something bad? What if I make mistakes? Grace turned from the stove, where she'd been heating oil for the fry bread, and joined the conversation. Little bird, let me tell you a story about mistakes. She settled into a chair at the kitchen table, her movements unhurried and deliberate. Everything about Grace carried the weight of wisdom earned through decades of living. And when she spoke, Sarah always listened with complete attention. When Joseph and I were first married, 43 years ago, I tried to cook dinner for his parents. I wanted so badly to impress them, to show them I was worthy of their son. So I spent all day preparing this elaborate meal, following my grandmother's most complicated recipes. Grace smiled at the memory, her eyes crinkling at the corners. And I burned almost everything. The bread was like charcoal, the meat was tough as leather, and I somehow managed to curdle the soup. It was a disaster. Sarah giggled despite herself, trying to imagine the always competent Grace creating such a mess. Joseph's mother took one bite of that terrible dinner, and then she got up and started clearing the table. I thought she was angry, thought I'd failed some crucial test. But instead, she went to the kitchen and started teaching me to cook properly. She spent the next 3 hours showing me techniques her own mother had taught her. What did she say about the burned food? Sarah asked. She said, "Child, mistakes are just lessons dressed up in different clothes. The only real failure is not learning from them." Grace reached over and smoothed Sarah's hair with gentle fingers. That night, I learned that love doesn't depend on perfection. It depends on the willingness to keep trying, to keep growing, to keep caring about each other. Sarah absorbed this story like a sponge absorbing water, adding it to the growing collection of evidence that she was truly safe here, truly wanted. But years of trauma couldn't be undone in a single conversation, and the fear still lingered around the edges of her newfound security. "But what about Marcus?" she asked, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "What if he gets out of jail and comes looking for me?" Joseph and Grace exchanged a quick glance, one of those wordless communications that long-married couples perfected. They'd been expecting this question, had been preparing for it since the day Sarah came to live with them. "Marcus is in prison for a very long time," Joseph said carefully. "The judge made sure of that. And even if something changes, there are laws that protect you now, legal documents that say you belong here with us. But more importantly," Grace added, "you're not the same little girl who ran across our yard 6 months ago. You're stronger now, braver. And you're not alone anymore." Sarah considered this, turning it over in her mind like a smooth stone. It was true that she felt different now, more solid somehow. The constant hypervigilance that had defined her early childhood was gradually being replaced by something she was learning to recognize as confidence. She still had nightmares sometimes, still flinched when someone moved too quickly in her peripheral vision. But she was sleeping through the night more often than not, and she'd started expressing opinions about things like what she wanted for breakfast or which books she wanted to read. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been built one small moment at a time. The first morning she'd slept past sunrise without being awakened by violence. The first time she'd disagreed with Grace about something and been heard rather than punished. The first time she'd made Joseph laugh with a silly joke. "Can I tell you something?" Sarah said suddenly, struck by an urge to share something she'd never spoken aloud. "Always," Grace said immediately. "Sometimes I feel guilty for being happy here. Like maybe I'm forgetting my mom or betraying her somehow." Joseph's expression grew soft and sad. "Oh, little bird, can I tell you what I think your mother would want for you?" Sarah nodded, hungry for any connection to the woman she could barely remember. "I think she would want you to be safe. I think she would want you to be loved and protected and given the chance to grow up without fear. I think she would be grateful that someone is taking care of her daughter the way she would have if she'd been able to." "Do you really think so?" Sarah asked, her voice small with hope. "I know so," Grace said firmly. "Love doesn't run out when someone dies, Sarah. Your mother's love for you is still here, still part of who you are. And now you have our love too, and there's room for both." Sarah felt something inside her chest loosen and expand like a flower opening to sunlight. For months, she'd been carrying the weight of conflicted emotions, grief for her mother, relief at escaping Marcus, guilt over her happiness, fear that it wouldn't last. But sitting here in this warm kitchen with these people who chose to love her, she began to understand that healing didn't mean forgetting, and that moving forward didn't mean leaving the past behind. The timer on the stove chimed, signaling that the oil was ready for frying. Sarah jumped up from the table, eager to participate in the familiar rhythm of preparing a meal together. As she carefully placed pieces of rolled dough into the hot oil, watching them puff and turn golden, she felt connected to something larger than herself. "Grace," Sarah said as she worked, "what does it mean that I'm adopted into the tribe too?" This had been another new concept for Sarah to absorb. The Running Bears hadn't just offered her a home. They'd formally adopted her into their extended family and tribal community. It meant she now belonged not just to them, but to a larger network of relationships that stretched back generations. "It means you have aunties and uncles and cousins now," Grace explained, flipping the fry bread with practiced ease. "It means you have a history and a culture that goes back thousands of years. It means you're a part of something bigger than just our little family. And it means," Joseph added, returning to the kitchen with plates for dinner, "that you have responsibilities as well as privileges. You'll learn about our traditions, our values, our ways of understanding the world." Sarah felt a thrill of excitement at the idea of belonging to something so vast and enduring. She'd spent her entire life feeling like she existed in isolation, cut off from any sense of continuity or connection. Now, she was being offered roots that went deeper than she could imagine. "Will I learn to speak Lakota?" she asked. "If you want to," Grace said. "Your great-aunt Emma gives lessons to the young people in the community. She'd be delighted to teach you." "I want to learn everything," Sarah said with sudden fierce determination. "I want to know all the stories and all the traditions and all the songs." Grace and Joseph smiled at her enthusiasm, but there was something deeper in their expressions, a recognition of Sarah's hunger to belong, to be part of something meaningful and lasting. Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into learning about her new heritage with the same intensity she'd once brought to avoiding Marcus's violence. She learned about the significance of the four directions, about the relationship between humans and the natural world, about the importance of community and reciprocity. She learned that her adoption into the tribe wasn't just a legal formality, but a spiritual commitment that connected her to ancestors she'd never known and descendants she'd never meet. She learned that healing was possible not just for individuals, but for entire communities, and that her own journey from trauma to wholeness was part of a larger story of survival and resilience. Most importantly, she learned that love could be unconditional, that safety could be permanent, and that the future could be something to anticipate with joy rather than fear. One evening in early spring, as Sarah sat on the front porch watching the sun set over the prairie, Grace joined her with 2 cups of tea. They sat in comfortable silence for a while,